If you look at a map of the United States today, it stretches from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific. But less than 230 years ago, the country was much smaller. It stopped at the Mississippi River. Everything west of that river belonged to foreign empires. But in a single day in 1803, everything changed. The United States suddenly doubled in size, gaining millions of acres of land overnight. This massive territory was bought from France for just $15 million. It is known as the Louisiana Purchase, and it is often called the greatest real estate deal in history. But the real story is not about the money. It is about a secret dream of an emperor, a disastrous struggle on a tropical island, and a looming conflict that forced the most powerful man in the world to give away his prized possession. This is the story of how the United States accidentally became a superpower. This story is 8 chapters long, and we hope you love it. Chapter 1. The Surprise in Paris. The story begins in the spring of 1803, in the crowded, noisy streets of Paris, France. The city was the center of the world, filled with soldiers, spies, and politicians. But for the American ambassador, Robert Livingston, it was a place of constant stress and failure. Livingston was a tired man. He had spent months trying to get a meeting with the French government, and every day he faced the same problem. He was trying to stop a war between his young country and the massive French Empire, but nobody in Paris seemed to care. The pressure on him was crushing. Back home in Washington, President Thomas Jefferson was waiting for good news, and the American farmers in the West were demanding action. They wanted Livingston to secure the city of New Orleans, the vital port that controlled the Mississippi River. If he failed, the United States might be forced into a war it could not win. Then, things got even more tense. A new man arrived from America. His name was James Monroe. He had been sent by the president on a special, urgent ship across the Atlantic Ocean. Monroe arrived in Paris with a bad back, aching from the long sea voyage, and carrying a very specific set of instructions in his pocket. The instructions were clear. The United States was willing to pay up to $10 million, but only for the city of New Orleans and the small pieces of land around it. That was the limit. They were not there to buy a country. They were there to buy a safety valve for American trade. Monroe and Livingston met in their small rooms to plan their strategy. They were nervous. They knew they were about to negotiate with the government of Napoleon Bonaparte, a ruler who was known for conquering land, not selling it. They expected the French to laugh at them, or to demand a price far higher than $10 million. When the meeting finally happened, the atmosphere was strange. They didn't meet with Napoleon himself, but with his finance minister, a man named Francois Marboy. The room was quiet. The Americans prepared their arguments. They were ready to beg for just a tiny piece of land at the mouth of the river. They started to explain why New Orleans was important to them, but before they could finish their speech, the French minister stopped them. He looked at the two exhausted Americans and asked a question that didn't make any sense. He didn't talk about New Orleans. Instead, he asked, "What would you give us for the whole of Louisiana?" Livingston and Monroe were confused. They thought something was lost in translation. They asked him to repeat the question. They thought he meant the whole province of New Orleans. But the minister shook his head. He stood up and pointed to the map of North America. He swept his hand across a massive area of the map, starting at the Mississippi River, going north to the Canadian border, and stretching all the way west to the Rocky Mountains. He meant everything. He was offering them the heart of the North American continent. The Americans sat in stunned silence. They were stunned because they had no permission to buy this land. They were stunned because this territory was larger than the entire United States at that time, and most of all, they were stunned by the price. The minister told them that Napoleon wanted $15 million for the entire package. The two Americans quickly did the math in their heads. They had come to spend $10 million for one city. Now, for just $5 million more, they could double the size of their country. It was a bargain so incredible that it seemed like a trick. Why would the most powerful empire on earth just give away its prized possession? Why was Napoleon, a man who fought wars for tiny scraps of land in Europe, suddenly holding a fire sale for half a continent? The offer was too good to be true, and the Americans knew that something huge must be happening behind the scenes. They realized that this wasn't just a generous offer, it was a sign of desperation. To understand why the Emperor of France was practically begging them to take this land, we have to leave the negotiation room in Paris and travel back across the ocean to the wild muddy banks of the Mississippi River to see exactly why this land was worth so much trouble in the first place. Chapter 2. The River of Life. To truly understand the fear that drove President Thomas Jefferson to risk everything, we have to look away from the manicured lawns of Washington, D.C., and focus instead on the heartland of the young American nation in the early 1800s. Back then, the United States was a country split down the middle. In the East, the world was relatively easy. Cities like New York and Philadelphia were already busy ports, connected to the global economy by the vast, open Atlantic Ocean. But travel west, beyond the great Appalachian mountain range, and you entered a completely different, much harder world. This was the American frontier, the lands of Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. These lands were filling up with tough, hard-working pioneer families. They cleared the forests, broke the soil, and worked from dawn till dusk, growing huge fields of corn, wheat, and tobacco, and raising livestock. They produced incredible amounts of food, but they faced a constant crippling problem. How do you sell it? Think about the sheer scale of the challenge. A single small family farm might produce 100 barrels of flour. To get that flour to the markets back east, they would have to load it onto wagons and drag it hundreds of miles over the steep, rocky Appalachian Mountains. There were no paved roads, only muddy, dangerous trails. This journey was so slow, so difficult, and so expensive that it was practically impossible. The cost of moving the goods across the mountains would be more than the goods were worth when they finally arrived. The farmers were essentially trapped. The only way out was water. The American farmers didn't look east. They looked west, to the immense, sprawling network of rivers that all flowed into one massive waterway, the Mississippi River. This river was more than just a body of water. It was the single, unchangeable economic artery of the continent. It was the nation's only true superhighway. The farmers would spend weeks building flat, simple wooden boats designed only for a one-way trip. They loaded everything they owned onto these vessels and began the long, slow, 3 to 4 month journey down the river. They fought the currents, dodged snags, and relied on the river to carry the fruits of a year's labor. It was a stressful, months-long gamble, but it was the only way their goods could ever reach the sea and be sold to the world. But this entire system, this lifeline that sustained the American West, had a single, terrifying flaw. The Mississippi River was a highway that ended at a gate. At the very bottom of the river, where it finally emptied into the Gulf of Mexico, sat the critical port city of New Orleans. New Orleans was the bottleneck, the choke point for every American dollar made west of the mountains. Every barrel, every sack, every boat had to stop there. The American farmers couldn't sail their flatboats into the ocean. They had to unload their cargo and transfer it onto massive ocean-going ships. The city provided the only way to store those goods until the ships arrived. This was known as the right of deposit. If the country that owned New Orleans decided to simply close the port to deny the right of deposit, the entire American Western economy would instantly collapse. The river would become useless, the farmers would face financial ruin, and their crops would literally rot on the docks. For years, the Americans hadn't been too worried. New Orleans and the massive Louisiana territory around it were controlled by Spain. Spain was a fading European power. They were weak, they were distant, and most importantly, they were easy to deal with. The Americans figured they could always negotiate with the Spanish. But then, the rumors that reached President Thomas Jefferson were confirmed. Spain had secretly handed the entire territory of the Great River, the immense wilderness, and most importantly, the gatekeeper city of New Orleans, back to France. Suddenly, the single, fragile lifeline of the American frontier was no longer in the hands of a weak, old empire. It was now under the total control of Napoleon Bonaparte. The fear was immediate and widespread. Jefferson looked at the map and saw that the fate of the entire American West rested on the whims of the most ambitious, aggressive, and powerful military commander in the world. The American economy was now dependent on the goodwill of a man who was already planning to conquer the entire world. This shocking change made the purchase of New Orleans a matter of national survival, forcing Jefferson to send his diplomats on a desperate last-ditch mission to Paris. Chapter 3. The Emperor's secret dream, the man causing this massive fear in America, was Napoleon Bonaparte. And in the early 1800s, he was an unstoppable force. He wasn't just conquering countries in Europe, he was reshaping the world with an ambition that knew no limits. When Napoleon looked at the map, he didn't just see land, he saw an engine of power that would make France dominate the globe. He dreamed of rebuilding a French empire in North America, and this new empire was based entirely on a simple, brilliant economic calculation. The most valuable thing in the world at that time was sugar, grown on the rich French islands in the Caribbean Sea, especially the incredibly productive colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. These islands made the French treasury richer than anything else, but they had one major weakness. They could ungrow enough food to feed the vast numbers of people working there. France had to spend huge amounts of money shipping food, wheat, and timber all the way across the Atlantic from Europe. This cost millions and took months, creating a massive drain on the treasury. Louisiana was the answer. Napoleon looked at the map and saw that the Louisiana territory was the perfect, gigantic supply depot. It was an enormous, fertile valley, sitting close to the Caribbean, and it had the massive Mississippi River flowing right through its heart. His plan was simple and genius. Use the land to grow enormous amounts of grain, cattle, and timber, ship it all down the river to the port of New Orleans, and then send it immediately to feed the sugar islands. This would create a self-sufficient, unstoppable economic machine that would fund Napoleon's wars and cement French power in the Americas forever. To put this incredible plan into action, Napoleon had to secure the land first. In 1800, he made a quiet, secret agreement with Spain. They signed the Treaty of San Ildefonso, which formally gave the entire Louisiana territory back to France. The treaty was kept completely secret because Napoleon knew that the United States would panic if they found out that the powerful French were now their neighbors, controlling their lifeline. But secrets rarely stay hidden for long. When rumors of the deal finally reached President Jefferson, his entire diplomatic strategy collapsed. He realized he was no longer negotiating with the weak, friendly Spanish. He was facing an emperor who was preparing for military conquest. Jefferson knew that the French army was massive, disciplined, and led by the greatest commander in history. The United States Army, by contrast, was tiny and scattered. If Napoleon decided to send even a fraction of his European forces to Louisiana, the young American Republic would be helpless. The threat was not abstract, it was immediate. Napoleon began to gather thousands of soldiers and massive naval transports, preparing to send his army across the Atlantic to secure New Orleans and begin building his American supply line. His military machine was fully set in motion. It looked like nothing could stop him from planting the French flag permanently over the heart of the North American continent and effectively crushing the American dream before it could even begin. Napoleon had made his move, but he was unaware that his massive, brilliant plan was about to be destroyed by two unexpected problems: a rebellion in the tropics and an invisible enemy carried by mosquitoes. Chapter 4. The Island That Broke the Empire. Napoleon Bonaparte's entire plan for a North American empire rested on a single, vital piece of land in the Caribbean Sea, the island of Saint-Domingue. This colony was known throughout the world as the crown jewel of the French Empire. It was the most profitable colony on earth, producing massive amounts of sugar, which was the source of France's enormous colonial wealth. Napoleon knew that without firm control over this island, the entire plan for Louisiana, the farms, the river supply line, the new French North America was completely meaningless. But the emperor was about to face a massive, unforeseen problem. The people of Saint-Domingue had suffered greatly, and they refused to live under French rule any longer. They had organized a massive resistance movement, demanding their freedom. Their forces were led by a brilliant and determined general named Toussaint Louverture. These defenders knew their land, they were fiercely motivated, and they were prepared to fight until the very end. Napoleon, furious at this challenge, decided to use overwhelming force. He sent a fleet of ships carrying thousands of his best soldiers, troops who had never known defeat in Europe, to secure the island and restore French power. He put his own brother-in-law, General Leclerc, in command, fully confident that this massive military expedition would crush the resistance quickly and secure the cornerstone of his American dream. The French soldiers arrived with immense confidence, but they immediately ran into trouble. The fighting was difficult. The island's defenders refused to engage in simple, open battles. Instead, they used the thick jungle and mountainous terrain to their advantage, making the effort costly and slow. Napoleon's troops were strong, but they were not prepared for the endless struggle against a determined and resourceful enemy. But the true disaster was not military. It was biological. Just as the fighting was grinding to a halt, the rainy season began, and with it came the invisible enemy, yellow fever. The disease, carried by common mosquitoes, struck the French forces with terrifying speed and ferocity. A French soldier could wake up healthy and be critically ill by sundown. The illness swept through the camps, spreading quickly because the French troops had no natural defense against it. It didn't matter how strong or well-trained the soldiers were. They were falling ill by the thousands. They lost more men to this fever than they did to the fighting. General Leclerc wrote frantic letters back to Paris, describing how his elite army was melting away in the heat and the swampy conditions. He begged Napoleon for more men, but he too eventually fell to the deadly sickness. This was the end of Napoleon's grand plan. The massive loss of life meant the French could not secure the island. Without Saint-Domingue, Napoleon's financial engine was shut down. He realized he could not defeat the combination of the determined resistance and the devastating tropical disease. He had gambled his massive military force on a tropical island and lost. He could no longer afford to send any more men or ships across the Atlantic. The dream of building a North American supply empire was over before it even reached the Mississippi River. This disaster left the emperor in Paris with an empty, useless territory in Louisiana and a looming financial crisis that would soon force his hand. Chapter 5. The ice in the ocean. While Napoleon's grand army was struggling and falling ill thousands of miles away, the first shockwave from the Caribbean disaster finally hit the United States. In late 1802, the American farmers' worst fears came true. The Spanish official who still governed New Orleans announced a devastating change. The right of deposit was immediately revoked. This was not just a bureaucratic action. It was like someone had suddenly slammed shut the front door to the entire American West. Without this right, American farmers could no longer unload their goods onto the docks to wait for ocean-going ships. The river highway was now blocked. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Thousands of flatboats, heavy with barrels of flour, tobacco, and bales of cotton, the result of a year's hard labor, were now trapped to The produce began to rot on the muddy banks of the Mississippi. The Western farmers were furious. They were facing instant financial ruin. They looked east to Washington, D.C., and demanded swift action. Their cry was for war. They said that if the government wouldn't seize the city, they would do it themselves, marching south with muskets to take New Orleans before the French army could even arrive. The national tension was at a breaking point. President Thomas Jefferson was caught in a crippling trap. He was a man who deeply believed in peace and avoiding debt. But the fate of the entire American economy was collapsing around him. He knew he could not risk a war with France. The small, young American military had absolutely no chance against Napoleon's massive army, but he also knew he could not let the farmers be ruined. If the West failed, the young republic itself would likely break apart. Jefferson needed a solution that was neither war nor ruin. He decided on a diplomatic gamble so risky that it felt impossible. He would try to buy his way out of the crisis. He called upon his most trusted friend and statesman, James Monroe, a man known for his calm resolve, and gave him an urgent mission. Monroe was to travel immediately to Paris to reinforce Ambassador Livingston. His instructions were precise. Offer France up to $10 million to buy the city of New Orleans and the land around it. This was the maximum price they could afford, and it was a huge risk for a country just recovering from debt. Jefferson sent Monroe off with the heavy weight of the nation on his shoulders, knowing that the entire plan depended on Monroe reaching Paris safely and convincing the most arrogant ruler in the world to sell what he had just claimed. Communication was slow and unreliable. It would take months to get a single letter back. Jefferson had to trust that Monroe and Livingston would somehow pull off this impossible deal without any further instructions. He knew that if the French refused, the United States would be left with only one desperate choice: to abandon its policy of peace and align itself with its old enemy, Great Britain, to fight for the river. The future of the Republic was sealed onto a diplomatic mission, unaware that the secret political and military pressures in Europe had already completely changed the game. Chapter 6. The Looming Storm. While James Monroe's ship was battling the waves of the Atlantic, the highest levels of power in Paris were in a state of sudden high-stakes chaos. Napoleon Bonaparte had finally accepted the disaster unfolding in the Caribbean. The loss of his elite army and the failure to secure Saint-Domingue had killed his dream of a vast French North American empire. He could no longer sustain a massive colonial project thousands of miles away, but that failure was immediately replaced by an even more dangerous crisis right in front of him. War with Great Britain was about to start again. The fragile peace between the two European giants was shattering. Napoleon knew this conflict would not be a small disagreement. It would be a total war for control of Europe. He needed every soldier, every warship, and, most importantly, every single piece of gold he could gather. Napoleon began to look at the massive Louisiana territory not as a future asset, but as an enormous, unavoidable liability. He paced his palace floors, weighing his options. Option 1, hold the territory. If he did this, the moment war was declared, the vast, powerful British Royal Navy would sail straight to the Gulf of Mexico. The French military forces in New Orleans were small and weak, and they had absolutely no way to defend the huge, sprawling territory. The British would seize the port and the entire continent for free, and Napoleon would gain nothing but humiliation. Option 2, sell the territory. If he sold it to the Americans, he would achieve several things at once. First, he would get a huge infusion of cash money he desperately needed to pay for ships, guns, and food for his war machine in Europe. Second, he would prevent his great enemy, Britain, from gaining that massive territory. And third, he would be giving the young United States a massive gift of land, instantly making America a stronger power that might eventually challenge British dominance in the New World. The choice was clear. The sale was no longer about money. It was a desperate, tactical military decision forced by the need for cash and the fear of the British Navy. On April 10, 1803, Napoleon called his ministers to the Tuileries Palace. He was visibly angry, pacing rapidly. He did not ask for advice. He gave a furious, sudden order. I renounce Louisiana. He declared that he had almost given up the entire territory to the British, but he would not let them win that way. He ordered his Treasury Minister Francois Marbois to approach the Americans and offer them the entire territory before they could even finish their dinner. Napoleon wanted the deal done immediately. Before the British could find out his intention, and before he could change his own mind, he had decided to liquidate his North American dream, sacrificing half a continent for the war machine he needed to conquer Europe. The Americans were coming to buy a city, and the man who ruled France was preparing to throw an entire empire at them. The stage was set for the final, shocking negotiation. Chapter 7. The Midnight Offer. When James Monroe finally arrived in Paris, exhausted from his sea voyage and carrying President Jefferson's rigid instructions, he expected the negotiation to be a long, miserable fight. He expected to argue for weeks, maybe months, just to secure the city of New Orleans for $10 million. Instead, when he sat down with the American ambassador, Robert Livingston, and the French minister, Francois Marbois, the reality was baffling. The French were not stubborn. They were in a desperate, frantic hurry. Monroe and Livingston were barely able to introduce themselves before the French minister looked them in the eye and asked the direct question that had stunned Livingston days before. What would you give us for the whole of Louisiana? The American diplomats were veterans of politics, but this moment left them completely speechless. They had come to Paris with authority to spend $10 million for a single city, and now they were being offered a massive empire, 2 million square kilometers of land for only $15 million. They were being offered an immense bargain, but they were trapped. The clock was their enemy. They had absolutely no authorization from President Jefferson to buy the entire territory, and they had no authority to spend $15 million. To send a letter back to Washington asking for permission would take 2 or 3 months. By the time they received a reply, Napoleon, who was constantly changing his mind, would have either canceled the deal or started his war with Britain. The risk was immediate. If they waited, they would lose everything. The pressure in that room was immense. Monroe and Livingston knew they were standing at a moment in history. They were two men, alone in a foreign city, forced to make a decision that would define the entire future of the United States. If they refused, they would lose New Orleans, likely trigger a war with France, and leave America trapped forever behind the Appalachian Mountains. If they agreed, they would be massively overstepping their authority and violating the president's instructions, risking their entire careers, but they would double the size of their nation. After intense, secret discussions that lasted several days, they made their decision. The deal was too good, the opportunity too critical, and the risk of war too great to ignore. They knew the price of 3 cents per acre was a bargain that would never, ever be repeated. They negotiated slightly on the price, but the core decision was made. Finally, on April 30, 1803, the 2 American diplomats and the French minister gathered to sign the treaty. The room was tense, but the relief was immense. As the ink dried on the parchment, Robert Livingston, the man who had worked tirelessly for months on this near-impossible mission, stood up and delivered one of the most famous lines in American history. He declared, "We have lived long, but this is the noblest work of our whole lives." They had achieved the impossible. They had left America aiming to buy a port, and they had just acquired half a continent. They had signed the papers, but the ultimate judgment on their decision whether they were fools or heroes would now fall to President Jefferson and the vast unknown lands they had just purchased. Chapter 8. A nation doubled. The drama of the Louisiana Purchase didn't end with the signature in Paris. It immediately moved back across the Atlantic to Washington, D.C., where President Thomas Jefferson finally received the news. When he opened the package and saw that his diplomats had not bought a city, but an entire empire, he was stunned. He had been given a massive gift, but it presented an immediate political crisis. Jefferson was a man who believed strongly that the government could only do exactly what the Constitution allowed. Nowhere in the Constitution did it say the president had the power to buy a foreign country. His political enemies immediately attacked the deal, calling it illegal and foolish. They asked, "How can we govern a wilderness that is larger than our entire existing nation? How can we spend this massive amount of money and bury the country in debt?" But the reality of the bargain was undeniable. The price of $15 million was too low, and the sheer scale of the land was too great to ignore. Jefferson realized this was an opportunity that might never come again. He put aside his constitutional worries, believing the necessity of the purchase was more important than the legal headache. After intense debate, the U.S. Senate approved the treaty, and the money was sent to France. In December 1803, the final official ceremony took place in New Orleans. The French flag was slowly lowered from the pole, and the American flag was raised. In that quiet moment, the young, fragile United States of America doubled in size. It instantly became a continental power, stretching its influence from the Atlantic Ocean deep into the heart of the continent. The true value of this deal, however, was not immediately seen. People thought they had bought mostly empty woods and swamps, but that land contained the rich, fertile Great Plains, which would eventually become the world's most productive farmlands. It held massive rivers, rich minerals, and vast forests that would fuel America's growth for centuries. The purchase also opened the door for President Jefferson to immediately send out the Lewis and Clark expedition, fulfilling the American dream of reaching the Pacific Ocean. The purchase was the single greatest catalyst for America's destiny as a world power. Meanwhile, back in Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte took his $15 million and threw it directly into his war machine. He went on to conquer much of Europe, but his wars eventually failed, and his empire collapsed. The money he got from selling America was spent and gone within a few short years. He gained a momentary advantage in Europe, but he lost the future of France and North America forever. The Louisiana Purchase is a powerful lesson in history. It shows how the desperate military needs of one powerful man, combined with the brave gamble of 2 diplomats, created an accident of history. Napoleon intended to destroy his enemy, Britain, but by selling that land, he accidentally created the United States superpower. The greatest purchase in American history was a consequence of a French defeat on a small tropical island, forever cementing the United States as the dominant force in North America.